Welcome back to a brand new episode of the MMA Beat. It is Thursday, February 18th, 2016. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani inside our New York City studio. We're going 3 deep this week. Why? Well, our colleague Luke Thomas is in Houston, Texas, covering Bellator 149. I'm guessing he is loving every second of it, and I hope you've been enjoying his coverage of the event thus far. He's had some good stuff, so do suggest you check that out when you're done watching this show. All right, we got a lot to talk about, including Bellator 149, so let's get right into it. That, of course, is the man in the shirt, Jeff Wagenheim of SportsIllustrated.com and the Washington Post, and of course, that is the man in the hat, Chuck Mindenhall of MMA Fighting.
I feel like I should be out there, don't you guys? I mean, this is my event.
Yeah, so it is. Sort of Are you sad about it?
I'm a little sad about it.
All right. Well, you can talk about it on this show.
All right.
Okay, let's get right into it. You know, like I said, a lot to discuss this week, but I want to start with Rampage Jackson, guys. Out of the blue on Tuesday, Bellator announces that they've actually come to terms with Rampage. Their year-long lawsuit is finally settled. They're back on good terms, it appears. Rampage signs a new 2-fight contract with Bellator. If anyone forgets, I'll briefly recap the saga that was Rampage versus Viacom. He claimed that they were in breach of their contract because they didn't provide him with the proper pay-per-view data after his fight against King Mo. He goes off and signs with the UFC in December of 2014. They claim that he was in breach of contract because he went off and signed with the UFC while still under contract with them. He goes and fights for the UFC after some drama leading up to the fight at UFC 186. He has that one fight against Fabio Maldonado, then back in legal purgatory, if you will. And now, out of the blue, they get him back. Signs a new 2-fight deal. He's back on the roster. Are you surprised that at the end of all of this, Viacom and Rampage actually were able to figure this out?
Surprised? Surprise and Rampage. These are things that this don't mesh. I mean, right? It's just what you recounted there is probably the tip of the iceberg when you think about all the back and forth that has gone on. Think about it. The guy has UFC, Bellator, just back and forth like crazy. So you know, you introduced it by saying apparently they're now on good terms. I would say it slightly differently to say now we could say that Bellator and Rampage Jackson are back in business together, at least. You know, who knows what the terms are. Now, we also should point out, though, that much of the disharmony that was at least on Rampage's side was with the previous regime at Bellator, and so we know nothing about whether he would mesh with Scott Coker.
I would like to add this, though. It almost feels like the harmony was with the previous regime. Why? Because he signed his contract with them, and they promised him a lot of things. Entertainment opportunities, they were going to push his fights, X, Y, and Z. And then, if you recall, the pay-per-view fight against King Mo was in May of 2014. Scott Coker takes over in June of 2014. Yeah. So it's really onto the new regime to deliver what he was expecting from the pay-per-view. And he's had some things to say about Scott. Scott's had some things to say. So I would actually surmise that the issue is really with the new regime as opposed to the old regime. I almost wonder if he wishes Bjorn, one of the very few people out there, wishes if Bjorn was still around.
You wish he was riding with Bjorn.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, to me, this seems very Rampage. This is Rampage in a nutshell. This whole thing, the way it's been played out. I was thinking about that on the way in. I was like, Rampage Jackson, you know, this guy has this pride legacy, you know, he's with the WFA and then becomes part of the UFC, he goes and becomes champion. There's so much drama that starts to happen. Even in like 2009 when the whole thing with Rashad was going down, he was talking about retirement at this time, you know, like going back to then, they put on a show for him specifically in Memphis. He doesn't do it because he then takes a role in the A team. It just seems like this type of drama follows him everywhere he goes. He gets disgruntled, he loses 3 fights in a row, he goes over there, he gets, you know what I mean? It's just, it goes on and on. This just seems to me like the next step in the Rampage saga, but for his sake and for like everybody else's on these hard algebra type of guys like this, you just hope that he can play out his contract and keep it cool, because I feel like every time he's in these situations, he's disgruntled on one way or another. Mm-hmm. And honestly, I didn't really, you know, him fighting in the UFC, it didn't really do that much. We were both in the Montreal thing, and it was when he kind of cameoed, I guess, back in the UFC at that point. But it really didn't do that much for me to see him fight anybody there anymore. I don't know. You can make some good fights for him, but ultimately, I'm okay with him. Like, if they put together him and Fedor, to me, that's a bigger fight than anything they could probably find for him in the UFC or something like that. So, in some ways, I guess as a fan, I'm a little more, like, if you're talking about from a fan's perspective, I'm a little more excited maybe him going in this direction to see some of those types of fights. But I just hope it's not one of these things where, he's before he even fights, we're in some kind of going back and forth, and Rampage tends to do.
It does seem like he fits the model that we've been seeing from Scott Coker over at Bellator. I mean, as we'll talk about later on, the fight card that's happening tomorrow night is at least at the top of it, is a great example of fighters who either were great and famous at one point, or fighters that just became famous for not even being great, but just were street fighters or whatever you want to call it. Seems like Rampage is kind of in the middle of all that. He really has, in a sense, at least in my mind, I don't think he's lived up to his nickname of Rampage. His fighting style once really embodied that. It hasn't really embodied that too much, but I think that he has an opportunity to try to regain that a little bit over in Bellator.
The good thing for him, I mean, ultimately, is he has won 4 fights in a row. I mean, you could look at the competition and say, well, he has actually won 4 fights in a row. You could say, like, he's still viable. Like, obviously, the UFC wanted him, so he's still a coveted piece. I feel like he's still going to draw eyeballs. So in some ways, like I've talked about the 205-pound in the UFC's division, the sort of the oldie circuit or the rehash circuit, where these guys, Mauricio Shogun Hua and those types who are just they're not really going for a belt at this point. They're just more like, you're going to put these guys in there, Dan Henderson, to see what happens when these guys fight each other from here on out. But to me, that Rampage is slightly above that still, and I feel like they can still get some good mileage out of him, especially like if he shows up in his first fight against, I don't know who they're going to look at, Tito, or I don't know who.
What do you think about this idea? And we'll talk about him later on. But Kimbo Slice is fighting. Could you imagine Kimbo versus Rampage? Because Rampage isn't going to shoot on Kimbo.
Right.
Both two hard-hitting guys, both guys who can sell a fight. Two names who, to the masses, the mainstream, the casual sports fan, they know who Kimbo is. Most of them know who Rampage is because of the. Could you imagine that for Viacom? That's a big-time fight.
He's got to get through Dada.
Yeah. I mean, let's not jump the gun.
You're talking Fedor Tito. I'm thinking Kimbo.
No, you're right.
You know what I mean? And I think for Viacom, that's a huge fight. That could be their best fight that they could put on, right?
It certainly would be one that would draw some eyeballs, and it really, again, it plays right into that wheelhouse of where Scott Coker seems to be taking the promotion right now. I mean, I think that you were talking about some of the elder names over in the UFC, and I think sometimes the interest that the UFC maintains in those guys isn't so much because they want them there, but they just don't want them over in Bellator. I think that's really where the interest in Rampage was. I don't know that he was much of a factor in the 205 division at all, but he does bring eyeballs to Bellator, ratings, money, etc.
Also worth noting, the UFC did not stand in his way here. I mean, they could have said, no, we're going to take you to court now because you signed a deal with us while you claimed that they were in breach of contract. They said, go out and do your thing. And I think, look, that's an honorable thing. And I think that the UFC should be commended there. They did not stop him from resuming his career because he did sign a contract with them that now he is essentially not living up to. I put him above Gracie and Shamrock. I still think there's some juice left in the Rampage name. And to me, it's going to be very interesting to see how they book him in these 2 fights. A 2-fight deal, so you can't necessarily put him in a title fight. And do you want to put him against a Liam McGeary at this stage of the game? So how are they going to book Rampage Jackson? Free agency is such an interesting topic in MMA, and he is not a traditional free agent. He had a deal, there was a lawsuit, but let's chalk this one up as a recent Bellator signing. This feels like, if you compare him to the 3 other guys who have been signed as of late, the free agents, Alistair Overeem, Aljamain Sterling, Benson Henderson, you can make a very strong case that Rampage is a bigger star than all of them. Rampage draws more than all of them. You can argue all day long about what he's got left in the tank, but to me, this is a big signing for Bellator. This is a big name that they can promote and that people will watch.
I mean, I wouldn't argue with what you're saying, the way you're saying it, but I would also say that bringing back Rampage Jackson at a time when if you negotiated better, maybe you might have gotten Alistair Overeem or Aljamain Sterling, for example. I think that this signing essentially keeps Bellator in the sort of the ghetto of fights that mean nothing, in a sense. I mean, I realize that there's money to be made, but if you could bring Alistair Overeem over, suddenly your heavyweight division has some, it means something. I mean, you can stack up Alistair Overeem against the best guys in the UFC. Aljamain Sterling is a rising guy. He may not be at the level of the top guys the UFC have right now, but he's heading that direction. Rampage Jackson is going in the other direction. So yeah, he can bring eyeballs, he can bring some money, but it does keep Bellator in that area of, they're not really going to be producing fights that really matter to people who follow the sport and care about the sport in the sense of who the best in the world is.
Okay, so let's talk about this then. Scott Coker came out, I believe, to you and said, we didn't really make an offer to Overeem. Of course, they had to talk to him or his representatives to be exact. Let's not play the semantic game here, but the price tag was essentially too high. It wasn't one that they wanted to go after. That wasn't the path they wanted to go down. Same, it appears, is the case with Aljamain. They didn't give him the second best offer out there. World Series of Fighting did. So are you surprised? Is this wrong by Bellator? Are they picking the wrong horses here? Yeah, Rampage is a big deal, but should they have taken the money? And he's gotten. I mean, Rampage is not going to sign for peanuts, right? I mean, he's a big star. He's been around. Are they picking the wrong guys? Should they have used that money to sign an Aljo and or an Overeem?
Well, I'll tell you what. If they had signed Aljamain Sterling, to me that was a big one because that would have actually sort of tipped you off to what they were thinking long term. They're thinking like, you know what, we want to have these viable guys who are just coming into their own. Because to me, that guy's a future champion in the UFC. I feel like he's got that kind of ability. He's also he's a star. I was watching him on MMA Hour, and it's just he's got that sort of charisma, going through the whole hair thing you guys are doing. I just think he's one of those guys. I think as people get to know him, he's going to become a little bit bigger of a star. But to me, you have a couple of really good 135ers in place in Bellator. It would have made some sense for them to say, like, look, this guy, we can have him come in and at least make names with the other, like match him up with these guys and you have big fights and maybe he becomes your champion and he's still undefeated. He was great in the UFC too. You lose nothing almost in that transaction. He's just a guy coming on. It would have almost been like the bridge between what Bellator is setting in place with guys like Aaron Pico and Ed Ruth. You know what I'm saying? The guys are putting on their horizon to sort of kind of get those ranks set up as they're going forward. But he would have been there already. To me, that was a big one. But I honestly never really believed it would get to the point where they go after him. But for some reason, I think that they think either extreme, like, down the road pretty far, or they think right now. And I feel like that Aljamain he doesn't really fit that.
So are you disheartened by that? Do you feel like, okay, all this Kimbo stuff is all well and good, we understand the play here, but if you're not going to go after the Aljamains of the world, at least even engage in some serious talks, then what are we really doing here?
In some ways, and especially for the athlete, because, like Aljamain Sterling was trying to determine his value. You would have almost liked Bellator to come in and give him something, even to press the UFC into giving him more, because it seemed like there was some gamesmanship on that level going on between the free agent markets, like these guys. So I in some ways, you would like to have seen him go after him and make the UFC kind of answer that a little bit. It didn't sound like they really did that. Maybe World Series of Fighting or somebody else stepped up, but I didn't really feel like did it seem to you like Bellator really came correct to Aljamain Sterling? I didn't really feel like
No, World Series was without a doubt the second best.
I mean, it's a little disheartening on that because you'd like to see them make an earnest effort for a guy like him. To me, like I said, who has nothing but upside. But
yeah, I mean, to me, I don't know whether I would say it's disheartening. I would just say that it defines the playing field. I mean, it further defines a playing field that we already knew, that we've already defined. The UFC is the place to go if you are looking to be the best in the world, and Bellator brings some of those people in there that might be able to make inroads along that avenue, but the bigger, more central mission at Bellator seems to be to get more eyeballs, to get and of course now the UFC does a little bit of that too. CM Punk, bring him in, but it seems like for the UFC it's a departure from the norm. Yeah. And for Bellator, bringing in the Benson Hendersons, that's their departure from the norm. They bring in the occasional guy who would be one of the top flight guys in the UFC, but they really fill the roster with people who are going to draw eyeballs, whether they're past their sell-by date, Royce Gracie, Ken Shamrock, Tito Ortiz, to a lesser extent Rampage, but it's certainly those guys, or they're guys who just are going to draw a lot of people that just want to see Kimbo Slice and Dada 5000 go out there and throw fists. That's their model, and I can't say that it's disheartening. I just would say that it just further defines what they are.
Okay, so you're not disheartened. But what are you thinking if you're Benson Henderson? Okay, I came here, I signed. There were a couple other big names out there who you can really build. Like you can make a very strong case that in the matter of 12 months, Overeem and Sterling would be champions in their respective weight classes, and those are guys that you can hang your hats on. With no disrespect to their current champions in those weight classes, but they're not lighting the world on fire as far as being draws. So if you're Benson, you're thinking, okay, what are we doing here? Of course, at the end of the day, the game is to make as much money as possible. He got the better deal for himself right now. But are you disheartened if you're Benson?
I mean, I guess it depends on what you were told. I mean, if in the negotiations it was all a conversation about dollars and opportunities that ended up being money opportunities, then you get what you asked for. But if during those conversations, Coker was saying to him, hey, we're also going to we're going to be going hard after some of the best guys in the UFC as soon as their contracts are up, and then you sign the deal, and then within a couple weeks you see that the two biggest guys went right back to the UFC, then you might be disheartened. So I guess it depends for me on what you were told.
Well, today's the NBA trade deadline, right? So let's make a deal. Benson and Rampage versus Aljamain Overeem. Which deal do you like better?
Man, that's a toughie. That's tough.
Because that's really the last 2 weeks. It's a fascinating time.
Because of where Overeem is at, I mean, where he's placed in that heavyweight division, not to mention, he gets this Rotterdam gig, which obviously was a big deal to him to be fighting in Holland, his native Holland. So he plays two big roles. So I still sort of lean towards the UFC's what they got on this, because I feel like he can, if he wins in his hometown, he's going to be able to sell that one, and then he probably fights for the title. And that's really what they wanted out of him the whole way. They've been sort of grooming him along, but he's never gotten there. He's sort of always left it at the altar. So I feel like he's a big piece where he's at right now. And then Aljamain Sterling, I mean, to me, that division, we talk about all the time, like the smaller guys, it's hard to get eyeballs on him. I feel like he's that one rare, who knows, it'll play out, but I feel like he's a rare sort of commodity because he has a big personality. He finishes his fights. He's undefeated. I feel like he's got a lot of things working for him to kind of make a splash. So I'd still side with the UFC.
I hate to sit on the fence. I kind of feel like it's equal right now. I
could see that too, though.
It feels like the two guys who went to the UFC, the two guys who went to Bellator, like really fit what both of them are trying to do. I kind of feel like in the early stages of this new free agency game, it feels like both are doing pretty well. Chris Lieben might actually. You're right. That's a good point.
Where's that tilted? Which way does it tilt it, though? That's
Bellator, for sure. The next one up is Matt Mitrione, at least as far as we know. Some of these guys, it's interesting. Like Overeem doesn't. He's almost. I don't know if you heard the interview, but it's like he's offended when you try to talk to him about it. And so we're still in this dark ages period where this stuff
trying to be negative.
Yeah, I don't get it. It's taboo. And then you have like Sterling who wants to talk about everything.
That was an interesting.
To me, the more knowledge, the better.
I mean, I would say that if there's any advantage, maybe Bellator. It's more important for Bellator to bring in more guys who are going to draw eyeballs, and because they can't always say, well, we've got Hoist against Shamrock this week, so next week in a couple months we'll go Shamrock against Tito, then we'll go Tito against. You can't just have the same guys compete, so you have to bring in some more guys who are going to draw eyeballs. So it was more important to them to get somebody. Whereas as good as Overeem is, there are a lot of good heavyweights in the UFC. Aljamain Sterling is rising toward the top of the UFC in bantamweight, but he may not be there quite yet. He's getting there, and there's enough other guys. So I would say that the Bellator has to sign these guys. The UFC, they have the dual purpose of course having those guys, but also making sure that Bellator doesn't.
I feel like Scott Coker's model too is never really to sort of replenish his cupboards, to have full cupboards. What he likes is to have guys that can sort of be at the top of the division and then add pieces to sort of complement and fit against those guys. That seems to be what he did at Strikeforce for a long time. He'd have like a handful of really good players at the top of each division, and then a bunch of guys you'd never really thought about, regional guys, whatever.
Yep.
So I feel like he's sort of continuing that model. So signing a guy like Sterling would have obviously been like, either you want him and you think he's going to, sort of rule your division, but you're not trying to just deepen your roster. I feel like that's the difference. UFC deepens its roster on this, things like that. They're always, there's a top whatever amount of guys, and all those guys, it's always playing forward, right? Like, well, imagine this guy, matchmakers. That's part of the intrigue. I just feel like Scott Coker's game is not really that. It's more like find the guys who, you want to have somewhat of a future path. You want to have some you can see where these guys are going, but mostly it's all about like just sort of mixing and matching as you go, and not really worrying about like filling that roster out.
Well, this is kind of a tangent here, but I really wonder what World Series of Fighting is going to look like in 12 months, because you're starting to see these guys like Marlon Moraes, their contracts are up.
Right.
And let's not forget about the connection to Ali Abdelaziz, who used to work for World Series of Fighting as their matchmaker, now has gone off and done the right thing and gone off and done it his own way as far as being just a manager and not double dipping. But he represents probably their three best fighters, Justin Gaethje, David Branch, and Marlon Moraes, and they couldn't get Sterling. It seems like they offered him the best deal, but what's the long-term play there? And they have a show this weekend that has very little buzz. It's interesting. There's actually 3 events this weekend: Bellator on Friday, World Series on Saturday, UFC. They all stayed away from each other, but World Series, it just feels like over time they're kind of going a different way. They're going the way of like the legacies or RFAs as opposed to being a third player.
If you are a free agent and you get a big deal from them, part of the factoring in is like that tangible saying like, wait a minute, do I want to go attach myself to a dying animal? Like that's sort of I would think the mentality a little bit as for guys like Sterling, like, he wants to get paid, but he also wants to be relevant in that, in his payday. He doesn't want to go someplace where he's basically going to be, some people, maybe he would have been a big fish in a small pond, but the pond is so small, nobody's even paying attention to it. You know what I'm saying? Okay,
let's talk about Wanderlei Silva here for a second, because he fits into this discussion as well. Yesterday, Nevada State Athletic Commission announced that, or I guess they decided that, they had to relook at his case. That was decided by the court, and I think Wanderlei's team was hoping for no punishment at all. Their case has always been he wasn't licensed to fight in Nevada, so as a result, they had no jurisdiction over him. Mm-hmm. Yes, it was announced that he was going to fight Chael Sonnen in a matter of weeks, but he had yet to apply for a license, and part of their statute claims that they have jurisdiction over licensees. Well, he had yet to apply for one, and that's why they're saying he ran away from the test. Right. You can make your own hypothesis there, but they come back with their own 3-year suspension now, retroactive to May of 2014, which means that it expires. He's a free man come May of 2017, and no fine this time. Of course, originally they gave him a lifetime ban, which was complete lunacy, and a fine as well. So Chael Sonnen, who was supposed to fight him, got a 2-year ban. That's up this summer, and he failed 2 tests. Did they get this right? Should you get a stiffer penalty because you ran away than the guy you were supposed to fight that failed 2 tests and only got 2?
Here's where your problem is.
Yeah, okay.
You're laying it all out in a very logical, systematic, and sensible way, but you were talking about something that involves the Nevada Athletic Commission.
Yeah.
And those two things don't work together. We've learned many times talking on this show that the Nevada Commission does not have guidelines, or does have guidelines but does not apply them in a very straightforward way. All kinds of factors can play in, and a lot of it seems to be, at least to my eyes, it seems that there's a lot of personal stuff that plays into this.
Yep, Pat Lundball.
Pat Lundball. So and the Nick Diaz pleading the fifth and all that kind of stuff. So by that criterion, then I would have to say that if you run away from a Nevada test, Wanderlei is lucky he didn't get the death penalty. I mean, it's really, this would seem to be the most indignation that the Nevada Commission could ever muster up. And so I'm not surprised that they threw the book at him, but.
Is this throwing the book at him though? Like the lifetime ban is throwing.
Well, that was throwing the whole library at him.
Sure.
That was blowing the library up.
And make no mistake about it. I spoke to Wanderlei's lawyer yesterday. They're not going away. They're going to fight this and go back to the courts and take this as far as they can. They still maintain that he should not be punished at all. And you have to wonder, is the fact that this happened in May of 2014. And this was before they came down with their new rules and regulations. So should they adhere to the new rules even though this happened before? And also, I still believe, they have a great point about him not being a licensed fighter at the time of the test. Yeah, he shouldn't have ran away or even admitted afterwards that he was taking a diuretic, but he was still not a licensed fighter, so they have no jurisdiction. And the guy who he was supposed to fight failed 2 tests and got 2 years.
That's why it's glaring, right? Because you're actually, the 2 guys are going to face each other. You look at their punishments, and again, it's just that same old thing where it's sort of arbitrary how they come up with these things. But I think you bring up a good point. When they brought up the sort of punishment scale and kind of what they were going to adhere, but it was well after all of this. I just feel like, Wanderlei Silva, he's a complicated guy. He's been one of those guys whose name usually been brought up in negative ways of late, and I feel like a lot of that has to do with obviously this whole situation. That's pretty big punishment as it is. I mean, he's already sort of served this sort of exile from the sport. He's basically been released from the UFC. Now he's free to go somewhere else. But now you're saying you're not going to be able to fight again until you're almost 41 years old. And I think they got good reason to be like, you know what? We weren't licensed there. All the things you mentioned, all their defense, and say you're taking the livelihood away from one of our guys. Now I know under Bellator banner he's still a fairly young guy at 41, but honestly, I mean you're taking away somebody's livelihood for that extra year when it really matters to him. I think if Wanderlei Silva wants to fight, which apparently he does. I'm sure he wants to do it sooner than later. I think it was you, maybe it was you who tweeted out that you thought 2 years was warranted. I thought it was 2 years was warranted because it would have been at least in keeping with the Chael Sonnen one. He could have returned this year. You would have still would have thought hey, there's that's a pretty cruel thing that he had to go through and all this. 2 years would have made sense to me. So that to me, again, as we're talking sense, but to me that's what his punishment should have been.
Also, since the UFC is out of the picture and he's possibly he can end up at Bellator. They haven't really signed him, but
they have included him in their fan fest. And the good news is that now that he's been released by the UFC, the good news for him is that at least he can get paid. Remember they announced him to be a part of it, and then the UFC said no, you can't do this. So the UFC again not standing in his way, and they had their issues. Now that he's not tied to them, he can at least make money that way. But how much money is he really making by showing up at Dave & Buster's?
But he also could end up fighting outside the country or in some other jurisdiction. He can continue to fight this in court, but by the time this all gets adjudicated, it's the whole thing will be over, isn't it? Isn't it going to end next year?
I mean, 2017.
Yeah, so basically a
year and change.
little over a year. So the courts move sort of slowly sometimes, and this could end up being, it's good that he wants to fight it, but it may prove that just waiting it out will end up being what has to happen.
Well, if I'm Bellator, I have interest in him, clearly. I mean, just based off of my previous signings. A Wanderlei fight against any of the guys we were talking about is obviously appealing. I advise him, don't go to Japan, because if you go to Japan or Russia or any other place that doesn't have a commission, you're only going to make it worse. Nevada is going to come back and really try to stop you from fighting here, and Bellator has to play by athletic commission rules. So just kind of keep him happy, keep him at bay by doing the Dave & Buster thing, and then sign him in May of 2017.
The Dave & Buster thing, I like it.
I mean, he is a name, and they're probably the most upset about all this, other than Wanderlei, because they probably would have swooped in and signed him right away if they would have said, he's free in May of 2016.
All the things that remain in play. As of May of next year. I mean, all the same scenarios, all the guys that he could potentially fight, and who knows, maybe they deepen their roster with other guys, maybe they add some other intrigues, but all the same things still in play. I agree with you 100%. Bellator, it makes, just from the way Bellator has been signing and where he's at in his career, it makes perfect sense that they should come together. And like you said, just kind of keep him happy. That's what he should do at this point, is just become a face, almost an ambassador for Bellator for right now, and however he can work that out. They've used him. They're using him this weekend. They've used Fedor in this sort of role. Just try to keep him happy and let him get rolling into his when he's ready to go again.
And also, not to diminish him as a sympathetic figure, but he did acknowledge his use of diuretics. The other people that have been wronged by the Nevada Commission, I think were wronged. Other degrees of being wronged. I guess I would say the other guys have been wronged worse. Nick Diaz, he failed or didn't fail test for marijuana. Even if he did fail for marijuana, which I would question, but even if he did, that's not a performance-enhancing substance. John Jones tested positive for cocaine. He shouldn't have been tested for cocaine.
Right.
So he, again, he did the coke, but it's not something that should have come down. Those guys, I think, have a major gripe with the commission. Wanderlei Silva has a gripe with the commission, but by his own acknowledgement, he did do something that would that if he were under their jurisdiction, he would have been fine.
But still,
Bellator's next move should be to get Chael Sonnen as soon as he's ready. Chael Sonnen, when that happens, they should be the first ones trying to sign Chael
Sonnen, at least from what I gather, really wants to return. I have a feeling it will be with you. UFC's not letting him go to Bellator. He's too big of a name. But to your point, okay, what if he didn't run away from the test, took the test, got caught because he was taking diuretics? What would his punishment have been? 2 years? right? Because that's what
Yeah,
Chael got for
probably.
failing 2 tests. So in a weird way, I mean, you should have just taken the test.
Yeah. Well, I think
It's worse to get caught with something in your system than saying, I'm not taking the test because I'm not licensed. Now, I don't think Wanderlei was telling that to the sample collector when he was there. This is something that they've probably concocted after looking at everything.
Right.
His lawyer is a great lawyer, Ross Goodman, very, very experienced and successful. But you know what I mean? It's strange. Like, should running away be worse than actually
well,
failing?
that's what they're saying. That
Right.
it's not just an admission of guilt. Like everybody keeps equating that, well, it's an admission of guilt, but it's actually an admission of guilt with an extra year of cowardice or something
well, it's
like
almost,
that.
it's like if you're driving and you all of a sudden you see the red lights behind you, the police are pulling you over, and instead of stopping and getting the ticket for whatever you did wrong, speeding or whatever, you just take off.
Right.
It's going to come back to
people
bite
off.
you in the ass.
All right. Okay, well, let's transition to Bellator 149 now.
Finally.
It's this Friday. We are, 30 hours or so away. And it's the big one we've all been waiting for. It's Gracie Shamrock 3, years in the making. And, of course, Kimbo Slice versus Dada 5000. Now, honestly, let's have an honest discussion about this. How do we feel about it? Knowing what we know about Bellator, knowing where they're going, knowing what their play is, knowing who Scott Coker is and what he likes to do, here we are. How do we feel about this?
Well,
And oh, by the way, the press conference, big nuts, small nuts, all that stuff.
it's crazy zoo. I guess when it happens outside the UFC, I'm a little less bothered by it. And I hate to have a double standard, but I have to admit that I do. When the UFC has something insane happen, like whatever, when they kind of soil the meritocracy
Yes.
that they've tried to maintain, it bothers me more. When this is more of a sideshow kind of thing. And it was funny when I was reading up on this fight, I realized that Gracie versus Shamrock is the first MMA fight that Scott Coker put together when he first moved Strikeforce into
First main
MMA.
event.
The first main event was,
I believe, March 10,
a
2006.
different Gracie against a different Shamrock, but it's kind of a full circle
This
experience.
is in his wheelhouse, yes.
Yeah.
So that makes it okay.
That right there. When I saw that, I was
Okay.
like, he's just returning home where he
Okay.
feels comfortable.
Well, the same notes when they first announced it they still play to me. It's the
Yeah.
same thing of saying, I don't know, Dada 5000, I don't think was on too many people's radars, even against a guy like Kimbo Slice.
come on.
Except for yours, I know you had him in your backyard.
He's ranked. I had him ranked.
But I mean, it's like to me that fight is sort of comedically sad. I don't know, like it's one of those things like let's sanction a back bar, brawl or something like that. Let's do something like that. Okay, but there's some appeal to that because obviously Kimbo Slice's like YouTube sensation moment. There was a reason people were tuning in for that. I mean, it was a menacing guy going against other menacing guys. Well, okay, we're going to do it. We're going to sanction it. So to me, it's sort of the same note of like, well, this is comedic and sad at the same time, but maybe fun to watch. Who knows? But then you get to the other one, and it's sort of just sad for me on this one because I feel like two guys who just haven't competed this long. I don't feel like it's going to look like a good fight. And you have, obviously we saw Shamrock perform a few months back, and take from that what you want, but the fact that Royce Gracie hasn't competed in so long, I don't know what to expect. I feel like what you should do, and I know we talked about this on another fight card recently, is like you should set your expectations down here, but watch it with your interest. If you're going to watch it with like this, I hope it's better than I imagine,
Sure.
And then maybe it will be. But I would set the expectation bar pretty low on this.
I also thought that the expectation bar is an interesting way to put it because I remember when it was Shamrock against Kimbo, I had the expectation bar low, and it surpassed it because Shamrock almost choked him
That's how
out.
you stay happy. You set
It
things
was
real low.
it was better than I thought it was going to be, and it was less. I had a pretty concussive conclusion, but I was looking at that fight going in as, God, Ken Shamrock's going to get hit in the head, and it's going to be an ugly thing. But he ended up being competitive in that thing. This one, at least, it's two guys who we can assume are going to be grappling heavy. So I'm not going to go in there watching and thinking, well, I'm going to watch two guys who are just going to, rattle each other's brains. I'm assuming that it's going to go to the ground, and we'll see whether the better man wins or what happens.
Does this upset you, though? Does it upset you that the Texas athletic commission is sanctioning this? Are you do you feel like we're setting the sport back? Because all different kind of hot takes are going to be going on Friday. A lot of people will be watching. I think it helps them that it's a Friday in February. Not a lot going on in the sports schedule like back in June when Ken and Kimbo fought. There's no NFL, there's no college football, so they have the schedule pretty much to themselves. There's no UFC on Friday, there's one on Sunday, so they're not competing with much. But does this bother you? Like, as an MMA reporter, and sometimes we almost have to be apologists for the sport when you talk to people. Like, when you have people coming up to you, are people saying to you, like, Ken, because I'm getting that.
Yeah,
people know who Ken and Royce are.
Yeah.
People know who these guys are. Is this bad for the sport, or is it just a fight that will go away come Saturday?
We were talking about CM Punk last week or whenever that was. We were talking about CM Punk and how Mickey Gall now has 2 fights, and if he goes on to fight another one, as he waits on the timetable, he'll have 3 fights. Well, he starts to distance himself from where CM Punk is in his career. It's a funny thing, because if you're sanctioning a fight like this, if Royce Gracie wants to fight, it should be against a guy like Shamrock. I mean, it's just he's what I mean. Like,
sure.
you're sort of you're measuring them. It'd be more egregious. They're like you're gonna have Ken Shamrock step in against Quentin Rampage Jackson. Well, suddenly you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense.
Right.
You have one guy over here and one guy over here. I'm almost, even with Kimbo Slice fighting to 5,000, I feel like that one's a little weirder to me in some ways, because I feel like Kimbo Slice has actually been around. He's been in this sort of circuit for a while now, even in some boxing and some of those type of measures. Where I don't, Dada 5,000 hasn't really been in that many. To me, that's a little bit further of a discrepancy, but honestly, I think that because we know they're not going to wrestle, I think we both know that everybody knows they're just going to stand up and try to fight like what they're known for. I still see it as pretty equal. So not really. I mean, as long as they're matching them, if they're matching them equally, and I'm not saying they should put 80-year-old people in there, but as long as they've demonstrated that they passed their physicals and everything makes sense, that they think they're on the same playing field and they can still do it, and they come to that conclusion, I don't really have a big problem with it.
Yeah, I mean, I earlier said that I'm not as offended by the Bellator matchmaking, but the same kind of thing going on in the UFC would bother me more, and I realize that's a double standard. But
I think
when I think about this, here we do have a weekend where there are fight cards on 3 straight nights.
Yeah.
Now, all the attention is on this one. I mean, I mentioned to you guys when we came in before the show that my buddy who works at ESPN, who not at all connected to MMA and has no interest in the sport. One of the first things he said to me the other day when I saw him was, "Hey, how's that Gracie Shamrock thing going to go?"
He was interested.
I don't know if he was interested in watching as much as he just was. He wanted to know what it was about.
Sure.
He knew those names.
Yeah.
He knew those names.
He's not alone.
He also was a guy who had watched pro wrestling at the time when Shamrock was doing that. So that's another.
But this
element
is what
of
they're
it.
drawing on.
They're drawing on that kind of person, and so to me, there's a sadness in the sense that a couple nights later, one of the more interesting MMA guys out there, Cowboy Cerrone, is fighting another guy also named Cowboy, and it's almost like I almost forgot that it was happening this weekend because it just was so much being overlooked. And then you mentioned the World Series of Fighting on Saturday, and I completely had forgotten that thing.
That was one of their best fighters, if not the best fighter on the roster is fighting.
That's so far off of my radar that it's ridiculous. But the fact that this is going to that more people are going to be paying attention to 52-year-old Ken Shamrock against 49-year-old Royce Gracie, in this cage, as opposed to watching a couple of guys in their prime, one of whom just fought for the world championship. That's sort of troubling.
I will say this: I have more fun thinking about Emmanuel Newton sort of sifting through the disturbance in his energy field, through this whole week, because it's like you forget guys like him. They've actually been downplayed as well. It's not like they're the greatest fights underneath it, but a couple of those guys are like they're guys that they should be drawing on.
Well, that is a point that I want to touch on, because if you recall when this fight was first announced, these 2 fights. They really only came out with these 2 fights. And I said on this show, I'm going to take a wait-and-see approach. And why am I taking that approach? Because if they load the other 3 fights on the main card with the MVPs of the world, the Michael Chandlers of the world, the Will Brookses of the world, the Pitbulls of the world, the Strausses of the world, okay, now what we're doing is we're going to push Kimbo and Ken and Gracie, but we're going to get people to watch these other guys, and hopefully that will translate into more eyeballs in the future. What does this card look like? It doesn't look like much, with all due respect. Lyndon Vassell, Emmanuel Newton, these aren't guys that are part of Bellator's future. This isn't their young core. These aren't guys that they're going to try to get you to watch in the future main event. That, to me, is the real failure here. This card is top heavy, no doubt about it. But if you had, when they fought in June, Ken and Kimbo, you had Chandler on the card, you had Strauss on, you had the young studs in squash matches, but they looked like superheroes, right?
They did. That's the thing that stands out. As you think about those fights, like
Right.
you still remember Chandler's fight very well because of that whole thing.
So what are we doing here?
Well, I think that's what
That's the
Coker
problem.
would say. In fact, that when I talked to Coker about this whole style of matchmaking, he kind of brought that up. Now, he didn't acknowledge that this card is lacking from this angle, but he did point back to. I'm trying to think which one it was. It was at the. It was the last Pitbull. It was a Pitbull title defense. That was the co-main of one of these fights. Maybe it was Tito versus Bonner, or it was one of these fights that was drawing a lot of attention with nothing there, kind of.
Sure.
And so he said that what we're trying to do is draw attention to our other build stars, as he put it. But it's not happening.
Yeah.
It's not happening. But that's is what his stated intention is to do that. And they've tried to do it on some occasions, but it doesn't seem like that's happening now.
Let me just raise this point. And I have the utmost respect for Scott Coker's career, his legacy, his resume, what he's done thus far. But the names I just mentioned, and correct me if I'm missing a few, MVP, Will Brooks, the Pitbull brothers, Daniel Strauss, throw out a couple others. What do they all have in common? They're from the old era.
Mm-hmm.
Who's the young stud that they built in the last year and change since he's taken over? June of 2014, we're approaching the 2-year anniversary of him taking over. Yeah, we've signed Tito, and we've signed, actually Tito might be from the Bjorn era, so excuse me there, but we've signed, Ken and Hoist and Kimbo and Dada. We've signed these guys, and Chris Lieben. We've signed these, and kudos on getting Benson. But what are we doing here? That's my concern about I get what Scott Coker's model is. It's been laid out. Undercard, let's go locally. That's why at the press conference yesterday he brought up Mick Maynard of Legacy. Let's sell tickets locally. For the live event, we got to go to the Toyota Center and sell tickets, and that's a model that worked for Strikeforce. There's no doubt about that. But then at the top, you mix the vets with the young studs. Strikeforce, if you look at the young studs that they had, from the Luke Rockholds of the world, the Kane, they even had Kane back in the day. What's happening now? I recall when Scott Coker was signed, when he was hired by Viacom, it was like, let's give him a year and a half, 2 years. Let's see who he finds, what diamonds in the rough. Pico and Ruth, I don't know if it's fair to include those guys because they're not really doing anything right now. Let's hanging hats on guys that are going to fight in 5 years. So I don't know. I have mixed emotions about this. Like if the rest of the card featured those young guys, I say I get it. I know what you're doing. It makes all the sense in the world. This card leaves me wondering why those guys aren't on the card.
What about this kid, Melvin Guillar?
Yeah.
They're trying to. No, I agree with you 100%. I'm like, we kind of had this discussion before. I don't see. I see it more as like, hey, we're going to do a big ratings on this thing. We're going to throw this fight together, but it has no meaning beyond that.
It's a short-term play.
Yeah,
it's not going to build to anything. Are people going to stick around and watch the next Bellator card because they saw this? They might. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm 100% wrong. He knows better than I. I don't know if that's going to translate into more ratings for the next show, the Bellator 150, which I believe is next week, and it's a much smaller card.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, but I would say that by Coker signing these elder names and not necessarily adding to the roster of young studs, as you put it, he's, I guess, just trying to put the window dressing on top of those existing young studs. Unfortunately, he's not included any of them on this card, which this was a missed opportunity. I think he did put some on previous ones. Yeah. This was an opportunity to, and when I talked to him, he said something like, well, you try to have these, he kind of said, well, everything is organic here. We're seeing who's available at different times. And so he kind of made it sound as though he didn't have too many people available at this time. But it seems to me that there are enough names that you ticked off that even if you had two of them, even if you put two fights together of young, top of your roster guys, that would have sufficed. But he didn't. But they're still going to draw big numbers. Yeah. What is it going to lead to?
And you mentioned a Newton, you mentioned a Gillard. They don't really seem to be included in the process. Like, even if you're going to say that these are the guys, are they at the open workouts? Are they getting that same kind of love? I don't really see that happening. By the way, if I may, one more critique. This fight really should be happening in Miami. And I think it was our own Luke Thomas who asked Scott at the press conference last week, and if it wasn't, I apologize. But this is a fight that's made. This is a Miami fight. Why is it happening in Houston? Okay, we need to move along. We could talk about this and I love talking about this. The promotional side of things is fascinating to me. But let's talk about Ronda Rousey. She had her first sit-down interview this week. I mean, she did the thing with Ramona Shelburne at ESPN, the magazine, but that was a written piece, and it's a little different. Then she comes on SNL, a totally different ballgame. A brief cameo on TNT this weekend when it was announced that she's on the cover of the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue, but this was her first interview about the fight. And the big nugget, of course, is that she said right afterwards she's in the hospital and she's contemplating suicide. What am I if I'm not this? If I'm no longer this undefeated, incredible fighter? And this took a life of its own. Like when I saw it, I was like, wow, this is Ronda Rousey wearing her heart on her sleeve once again, giving a riveting interview on a major platform, Ellen. This is who she is. Great. This thing exploded. I mean, for me personally, I was asked to be on the Dan Patrick Show, which was mind-blowing to me. A little bummed that Dan Patrick wasn't the host that particular day, but still.
He was bummed too. Yeah.
And it was talked about everywhere. Fox Sports Live asked me to come on. They never asked me to come on when I'm not doing UFC Tonight. Everyone was really riveted by this. And so I want to get your take on it. Like, the reaction to it, does it surprise you? What she said, did it surprise you? What did you take away? I think there's a lot to take away from all of this, but what did you take away when you initially heard what she had to say?
I mean, you're right. There's a lot to take away from it. My initial reaction was probably similar to yours, which is just that, you know, she's being honest, almost confessional in a really weird way because she's on this platform that's going out to millions and millions of people. But I didn't put too much stock into it because she mentioned it was a fleeting thought that she changed, you know, But then you start to think about deeper, obviously, with her family, given her family's history with her father and stuff. And that's where it starts to get a little weird, that maybe there could be a trigger in her mind that does this. And the fact that she's still in this fight game, the fact that she's being pressured possibly into a second fight coming up with Holly Holm, and that she's basically building the same ramparts around the same competitive ego that she had before, and that thing could crash down again. All these things start to occur to you, and you think, will she be better off if she, can she absorb another loss like this? Because I really believe she had put her identity into that cage, like her whole identity, and she thinks she lost it when she came out. And that's what you think after you kind of go through this process. And it's a weird thing. I don't want to make a big, it's one of those ones maybe we are making a mountain out of a molehill, because the bottom line is, a lot of people have fleeting things, especially fleeting thoughts about things like this, because you lose something as catastrophic as emotionally to her as that, right? What's the easiest thing to think in the immediate while you're trying to sort of digest your new reality? Oh, maybe it's just better to end it all. Maybe not think about it, just get rid of it. I mean, that's just, to me, it's in some ways, I'm not saying it's the most natural thought, but it borders on a natural thought to think those types of things through. You know what I'm saying? So I go back and forth. I mean, but I hope that it's not a trigger for her mind, obviously.
Does it raise red flags? Like, are you saying to yourself while watching her there, and it looks like she's a little uncomfortable in the interview throughout, just with the whole process and talking about it. Are you saying, forget about July, we know that's not happening, but this is someone who's deeply affected by this fight, and still, even though she's saying she's not anymore, this is only 3 months ago.
Yeah.
This fight was 3 months ago. It's not crazy to think that she's still figuring it out, and the wound is still very fresh.
She could be a broken fighter. I mean, that's how I think she's that affected by this fight. And that's somebody, I think it was Mike Tyson's, did you see this? There was a piece of Mike Tyson's old manager who wrote, and I thought that was really good, because that's the way I sense it too. I feel like...
Explain what the manager said.
Well, there was a piece where Mike Tyson's old man, I forget his name, do you recall?
I don't recall.
So he basically was saying that Mike Tyson lost to Buster Douglas, and I think he was more comparing it to maybe it was a Holyfield later or something along those lines. Yeah, it was a Holyfield fights, and he was saying that he didn't want to do the rematch right away.
It would be a mistake.
It would be a mistake. They had an avenue planned out for him, maybe to get an easier fight, to kind of get things built back up. The finances were all in check and stuff, but it just didn't work out that way, and it sort of ruined him to kind of go through the process he did, going back at Evander Holyfield, the bite in the ear and all this thing. And I feel like right now Ronda Rousey is sitting in a really horrible spot in her career, because the public pressure is for her to fight again, very similarly against the person who beat her. In her mind, she's having to rebuild herself as somebody who can do it. That might not be as easy, because they mentioned in that article that we're not the ones in there getting taken apart in the cage, having everything fall down. I think that all of that, she'd gotten by with the way she fought for so long. That's not going to do it. She's going to have to adjust. There was so much pressure around her that's not going to go away. It's only going to intensify. It's just a really, really hard time for her. And I wouldn't be surprised if she's just not the same fighter in general. But if you're asking me, she should want to fight somebody else before she jumps in there again. And I don't think it's an act of cowardice. I just think that she has to put her mind back to where she was.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that I took from it was not so much sort of a little bit the opposite of what you were pointing out, the short passage of time since that loss. I was thinking about it the opposite way, as the long amount of time between that loss and her appearance on the Ellen DeGeneres show, and that she had those thoughts in the direct aftermath of that loss. As Chuck says, it's not, I won't say it's natural, but it's certainly not so unusual, because she was so wrapped up in her identity as not just a fighter, but as an indomitable fighter, and that all was smashed immediately. So she had these horrifying thoughts, but to now, months later, be talking about that. Now, I commend her for and even on the show, Ellen commended her for showing her vulnerability, and I do commend her for that. But I also think that a lot of people might have had that thought in the aftermath of the fight, and then kind of just processed it and chalked it away and moved on, and not really gone back into that place, and just maybe talked about where they're trying to build themselves back up. But she still seems like she was there. When she was in that moment and she started breaking down, it was as though she was still in that moment. Even though she described it as a fleeting thought, it was just sort of this momentary thing, what was going through her head. She was still at the aftermath of that fight, as she sat there on the couch talking to Ellen DeGeneres. And so this is, that's where this is the first time that I've actually bought into the somewhat popular idea that she really needs more time away. So many people have been saying that in the aftermath of the fight, but to me, I looked at it as, well, she lost the fight and maybe she builds herself back up and she goes and gets it. But this was the first time where I saw where she's at now. All this time has passed and she still felt like she was a wounded person.
I think it was you mentioning on the Dan Patrick show, which you were excellent on, by the way.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Very kind of you.
But you'd mentioned, that a lot of people are thinking of it in wins and losses. They're thinking of it almost in terms of, well, we've seen other greats fall. We've seen GSP. I think that was the example you gave, and he never lost again. I mean, it does happen. But I'm not sure. It was weird with GSP. It's almost like he turned the screws to guard against complacency so deeply that he became obsessed. And that's how he just was never going to be. Nobody was going to want it more than him, it felt like, as he kind of went from there on. I'm not sure that we're dealing with the same sort of situation. I really get the sense that Ronda Rousey feels as though, maybe, or it feels to me at least like, Holly Holm has like a piece of Ronda Rousey's soul in a jar sitting on a mantle in her house
and
right
also
now. You know what I'm saying?
GSP didn't have those other things pulling him away.
That's true.
GSP, all he had to focus on was getting that belt back. She has the movies.
Right.
She has the Sports Illustrated thing that just came out, and who knows what else she has. I think for Ronda, the biggest lesson right now in all of this is, if you thought that your star was going to shine less, if you were less of a superstar, if you were less relevant by losing to Holly Holm, if you thought that was going to be the case, the last month has taught me once again that losses in MMA don't mean as much as we may think they do. In the last month, coming off this horrible loss, a devastating loss. She's hosted SNL. She's on the cover of SI. She's on the Ellen DeGeneres show. I mean, those three things alone, after a loss, are things that you really didn't think was going to happen to her. I mean, it's not, you know what I mean? So don't worry about that. But I actually now am starting to think the way you're thinking. I was thinking, okay, the mainstream media was making too big of a deal out of this. It was almost like they were taking her comments as she's suicidal right now. She's not suicidal right now. She was saying that she was thinking these thoughts that night. But you're kind of making me think about it a little different. I still feel like she needs to take an extended period of time off, and I wish she could do it maybe alone and not in the public eye, not doing all these other things. But is this the next Gina Carano in that sense? Like, does she
know.
never come back?
I mean,
She has to be able to content herself in her new world then. I mean, I feel like Gina Carano, that's one thing she's really done is fell in lockstep with Hollywood. Hey, this is great. I don't know if that's Ronda Rousey's
never came back after a loss.
I think if Ronda can content herself with that, and that's what she wants to do, then great. But I feel like the competitor in Ronda Rousey is the reason she has these thoughts to begin with. So like she believes she's that great, and that's a blow to her identity. So it's a matter of how can she transition?
Sure. And people have different psychologies, obviously, but beyond that, they have different levels of celebrity. And there's nobody who has ever in this sport had the level of celebrity that Ronda Rousey is, and that puts her under such a hot glare of spotlight that everything gets expanded. Her loss. It wasn't just that she was the most dominant fighter in the sport at that time, but she was also a mega celebrity. So it seems like everybody in the world knew immediately that Ronda Rousey got knocked out tonight. This was something that was huge. In some ways, I would say that we made that comparison to Mike Tyson, but Mike Tyson's thing was kind of an obscure fight over in Japan that a lot of people kind of ignored because they thought it was something that wasn't going to be a big deal anyway. This was a big deal.
She believed and embodied the things that were coming at her. Joe Rogan, for instance, just basically saying this isn't a once in a generation, this is a once in a lifetime, once in an ever. I mean, those types of comments. I didn't feel. I mean, it was so funny because with her, that wasn't even hyperbole. It was almost like everybody was basically saying and believing the same thing. Every fight she was going to be in was a sort of it was a foregone conclusion she was going to win. I mean, she was just in a very rare position. And
she had an incredible amount of pressure on her for the fight alone, the stardom alone, and then when you include all the drama with her mom, Edmund, all that stuff. I mean, there was so much going on. It really was a perfect storm. And who would have thought that of all people, in my opinion, the guy who had the best take on this was Brock Lesnar. Brock Lesnar said two things on ESPN this week that I thought were spot on. First of all, she needs to get comfortable with the idea of losing. And he said that once he got comfortable with that idea, he felt like a different man. And he learned this early on. Now, Ronda Rousey has lost in her life, most notably in the Olympics. She got a bronze medal, which obviously means that she lost.
Right.
But as an MMA fighter, she never did. And she needs to get comfortable with the idea that she's not invincible. She always talked about being undefeated and fighting against herself, and it was her legacy. Well, you need to get comfortable with the idea that this could happen again, and it's part of the sport. Everyone.
She didn't take the Olympic loss well either.
She did not.
That's the whole thing. Like in her book and stuff, you realize she does not lose well.
And then, and it's almost like, okay, some fighters are of the mindset. Like, look at Chris Weidman, and who knows if they're telling you the truth, but he's like, this is the best thing to happen to me. The O is gone. I can go do a little work here with Mark Henry. I could try some new things. Yeah. If she's going to go back to that same well, is she really learning from the loss? Is she really taking this opportunity to rejigger some things? That to me is going to be interesting as well, because if you don't learn anything, if you don't take this opportunity to take a step back and say, now I don't have the pressure of the O on my shoulders, then you're not really using this to your advantage.
Well, the fight game is about fooling yourself, really. It's either fooling yourself that you're so unbeatable that nobody can touch you, which it seems as that's where Ronda's gone, and then she gets devastated when she loses, or you go the opposite way, where I'm sure that Chris Weidman, I heard him say all that stuff about this is the best thing that happened to him. I'm sure that in his private moments, it's not the best thing that ever happened to him.
He's a psych major from Hofstra.
That is true.
I mean, so there's, it's.
But the other thing that Brock said that I thought was very interesting was that she needs to figure out who she is. You can't dip into Hollywood and come back and do a training camp while filming a movie. You have to kind of pick one or the other. This idea of doing both never works out for fighters in particular. And if her time off is going to be filming a bunch of stuff and then going right into a training camp with any self-reflection, with any rejiggering, that's an issue as well. She needs to decide who she's going to be right now in the prime of her life. Is she going to go for it as a fighter and then do the Hollywood stuff after? I don't know if you can double dip.
But
it's a very difficult
thing. I don't think we can fault her for that, because she had been double dipping very successfully.
But it was going to come. It was going to come to a head.
Who knew?
You were going to meet.
If
she wasn't doing it for that long.
We were having this conversation the day before the Holly Holm fight, could you even imagine? Could you see anybody out there who was going to defeat Ronda Rousey? Very few people saw anybody out there.
And that's not a reason to dismiss it. Now the warning signs are there.
She was maintaining. She was doing both things and being as dominant a fighter as you could be.
But maybe that led to her demise.
It could be. But that's what we see now. That's the retrospect. but all the stuff that led up to it, she was doing great.
Yeah.
I just don't think it ever occurred to her that she couldn't do both. I mean, I think she thought, I'm cruising on, this thing feeds this, but it's all based on this, and I think she just thought that was going to continue, and that was a huge curveball she got.
And I'm just annoyed that they put her on the SI. I mean, they promised me that I was going to get the
body
cover.
paint.
They didn't have enough body paint. They ran out of
that chest hair. Look at that. It's a beautiful thing. Final note on her. I'll just say once again, she's as popular as ever. That's very clear by the reaction to this. And again, I've seen some people kind of shrug their shoulders and say she's being a little dramatic. It reminds you once again why she became as popular as she became. She is someone who has an ability to connect with people. She wears her heart on her sleeve. She's very open and honest. It really does speak to the sport in general, as I mentioned yesterday. Like, fighters just speak a different way. They're honest in a different kind of way, and no one more so than her. And for her to come out on national television, considering the history, the wounds there with her father, took a lot of guts. And from what I understand, that wasn't planned. That wasn't a PR thing. No one really knew except for Travis, from what I understand.
It's kind of crazy that whatever she says, literally it takes, like you're saying, you didn't think it was that big of a deal, and then all of a sudden it becomes this big deal. I feel like she's so tied into our pop culture now that anything she says is magnified that much more.
Yeah. All right. On that note, we are out of time. Thank you so much for watching the show. Like I said, a very busy weekend in MMA coming up. Bellator on Friday, World Series of Fighting on Saturday on NBCSN, and of course the UFC on Sunday night on FS1. Cowboy versus Cowboy. There can only be one. So stay tuned for that. And the good news is we're back next week. I won't be here next week. I'll be in London covering the big Michael Bisping versus Anderson Silva fight. But these guys, and I'm assuming Luke as well, will be here holding down the fort. So I look forward to watching you guys from overseas.
Yeah.
All right.
We'll do it.
On that note, we say goodbye. That is Jeff. That is Chuck. I am Ariel. Thank you so much for watching. Enjoy the fights and enjoy your weekend.